In the Gilded Age, the most dangerous weapon was not a pistol or a newspaper. It was a sister with access to the family ledger. In ballrooms lit by gas and gold, they learned to smile while counting each other's losses. But when inheritance became a contest, weddings turned into business deals, mansions became threats you could see from the street, and charity became a way to bankrupt a rival in public. This is the story of three sister wars that began with silk invitations and ended with lawyers, locked doors, and fortunes cut into pieces. The ballroom where love became debt. The invitations looked harmless until one sister realized the guest list was a map of who still feared her. In the winter of 1883, New York society operated on a simple principle. Money could buy a mansion. Only acceptance could make you matter. The ballroom was not a place for dancing. It was a courtroom where verdicts were delivered in whispers, where a woman could be sentenced to irrelevance without a single word spoken aloud. And in that world, sisters learned early that family affection was a luxury they could not afford. The rules were invisible, but absolute. Mrs. Caroline Astor held the social register like a passport office, and her list of the 400 was the only border that mattered. 400 people. That was how many could fit in her ballroom, and if you were not among them, your fortune meant nothing. Your mansion was just architecture. Your jewels were just stones. The sisters understood this arithmetic better than their brothers ever could. A man could build railroads or corner wheat markets and earn respect through ledgers. A woman had one asset, her name. And if that name was whispered with doubt or pity or scandal, she became worthless no matter how many millions sat in trust. So they fought, not with fists or lawsuits, not yet. They fought with seating charts and invitation timing, and the careful choreography of who arrived when and with whom. A sister who controlled access to the right dinner party controlled everything. She could elevate a niece into a duchess or condemn a rival to a season of empty afternoons. She could make or break engagements with a single raised eyebrow at the opera. The first betrayal always looked like kindness. It began with an offer to host. One sister would propose a ball to celebrate another's daughter, a generous gesture that seemed motivated by love. But the execution told a different story. The date would conflict with another family event. The guest list would exclude the rising families the other sister had been courting. The menu would reference an inside joke that humiliated in code. And by the time the wrong sister understood what had happened, the invitations were already delivered and the social damage was irreversible. This was warfare conducted in gilt script on cream cardstock. The season of 1884 saw the pattern accelerate. The Livingston sisters turned a charity gala into a referendum on which branch of the family deserved the legacy. The Whitney daughters used a wedding reception to freeze out cousins who had sided with the wrong faction in an inheritance dispute. The Vanderbilt women staged overlapping events to force guests to choose sides, and every choice was recorded and remembered and later weaponized. They kept ledgers. Actual ledgers. Who attended which event, who sent regrets, who arrived late and left early. These notebooks were more valuable than stock certificates because they mapped loyalty and leverage. A sister who knew exactly who owed her a favor and who owed her an apology could navigate a decade of social combat without ever losing ground. But the cost was invisible until it was too late. Because while they were counting slights and measuring revenge, they stopped counting each other as family. A niece became a pawn. A daughter became a treaty term. A mother became a prize to be won or a weapon to be turned. And the moment love became transactional, the moment affection required a receipt, the family ceased to exist as anything other than a corporation with blood ties. The question nobody asked until it was too late was simple. When did we stop being sisters? The answer lived in those invitation lists, in the careful exclusions and the deliberate humiliations. It lived in the moment one woman looked at another across a candlelit table and saw not a sibling, but a competitor. It lived in the realization that the greatest threat to a dynasty was never an outsider. It was the woman who knew all your secrets because she had grown up in the same nursery. And once that realization took hold, there was no path back to innocence. The marriage market that bought silence. When the engagement ring arrived, it was not a promise. It was a contract designed to trap a rival. In 1885, Alva Vanderbilt learned what her daughter was worth. $3 million in railroad stock, a Fifth Avenue mansion, and a guaranteed title. That was the price of marrying Consuelo to the Duke of Marlborough. The contract took 6 months to negotiate. The wedding took 4 hours. The love was never part of the equation. This was not unusual. This was the system. A Gilded Age marriage was a merger. The bride brought capital, the groom brought legitimacy, and both families brought lawyers who treated romance like a hostile takeover. Settlement agreements ran to 40 pages. They specified dowry amounts, annual allowances, property rights, and the exact terms under which money would flow if the marriage failed. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was left to love. The sisters weaponized this machinery with surgical precision. When one branch of a family wanted to humiliate another, they did not spread rumors. They announced a better match. A sister who had been quietly courting a baronet for her daughter would wake up to news that her rival had secured a duke for hers. The announcement would appear in the society pages with enough detail to make the comparison devastating. Older title, larger estate, better bloodline. The message was clear. Your daughter is worth less than mine. The timing mattered as much as the title. A wedding date could be moved to conflict with another family event, forcing relatives to choose which ceremony to attend. A church could be booked to deny it to a rival. A honeymoon destination could be selected to overshadow another couple's plans. Every detail was strategy, and every strategy was designed to maximize visibility and minimize mercy. But the cruelest weapon was the leak. In the summer of 1886, the Jerome sisters learned this lesson when details of a failed engagement negotiation appeared in town topics before the families had even finished arguing. The article listed the exact dollar amounts that had been offered and rejected. It named the specific clauses that had caused the breakdown. It quoted private letters that should never have left the lawyers' offices. The humiliation was total and public and permanent. Because once the market knew what you had offered and been refused, your value collapsed. Other families would lowball you. Other suitors would demand better terms. Your daughter became shop-worn goods, no matter how beautiful or accomplished she was. And the sister who had leaked those details knew exactly what she had done. She had turned a private negotiation into a public execution. The daughters paid the price. They were the ones who stood in receiving lines smiling while strangers evaluated them like livestock. They were the ones who endured fittings for wedding gowns they did not want to wear. They were the ones who sailed to Europe to marry men they had met twice, all because their mothers had turned marriage into a competitive sport. Some of them broke. Consuelo Vanderbilt would later write that she cried through her wedding ceremony, that she begged her mother to cancel that she understood she was being sold, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But the contracts were signed, the announcements were made, the church was booked, and the dynasty's reputation depended on her compliance. So, she complied. And in doing so, she proved the system worked. A daughter could be forced into a loveless marriage if the social stakes were high enough. A title could be bought if the price was right. And a family could maintain its position by treating its children like assets to be deployed in a war that never ended. The other sisters took notes. They learned that marriage was not about happiness, it was about control. Control of money through settlement terms, control of reputation through public announcements, control of the future through the production of heirs who would inherit the fight. And if a daughter had to sacrifice her heart to win that control, well, that was simply the cost of staying in the game. By 1888, the pattern was normalized. Every major family had at least one marriage that existed only on paper. Every ballroom held at least one couple who smiled for photographers and slept in separate wings. And every daughter of every ambitious mother understood that her wedding day was not about love. It was about leverage. The question became inevitable. What happens when a dynasty's future heirs are born from transactions instead of affection? The answer would take a generation to reveal itself, but the seeds were planted in those marriage contracts, in those settlement negotiations, in those careful clauses that protected money but killed intimacy. The children born of strategy would inherit the war, and they would fight it with the only tools they had been given: lawyers, ledgers, and the absolute certainty that family was just another word for enemy. The mansion built to spite blood. She did not build a home, she built a warning, and she placed it where her sister could not ignore it. In 1889, Alva Vanderbilt broke ground on a summer cottage in Newport. Cottage was the polite term. The truth was marble house. $11 million, 50 rooms, 500,000 cubic feet of imported marble, a structure so aggressively opulent that it made neighboring mansions look like gardeners' sheds. This was not architecture. This was a declaration of war written in limestone and gold leaf. The location mattered as much as the cost. Alva chose a plot on Bellevue Avenue where every carriage entering Newport would pass her gates, where her sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, would see it from her own mansion's windows, where the sheer scale of the thing would make a statement that required no words. I won, you lost. This is what victory looks like. The Gilded Age invented competitive construction. Mansions were not shelters. They were weapons. A family could destroy a rival simply by building something bigger, grander, more expensive in a location that forced comparison. The mansion said things its owner could never say in polite company. It said, I have more money than you. I have better taste. I have won the game we are all playing. And once one family escalated, the others had no choice but to match or be erased. The numbers told the story of collective insanity. In the summer of 1890, Newport hosted 64 estates valued at over $100,000 each. Some reached $5 million. A few surpassed $10 million. The breakers, commissioned by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, required 2,000 workers, cost $7 million, and then contained 70 rooms that would be used only 3 months each year. The Elms, built by the coal baron Edward Berwind, featured Venetian paintings, French furniture, and a staff of 40 to maintain a house that stood empty 9 months out of 12. This was scale designed to humiliate. A single ball could host 600 guests. The catering alone cost $15,000. The flowers were shipped from Paris and replaced daily, even though they would be seen for only 4 hours. The orchestra was imported from New York at a cost of $2,000 for a single evening. The champagne was vintage, the caviar was Russian, and the waste was deliberate, because waste proved you could afford it. The staff numbers made the excess tangible. The breakers required a household of 33 servants for a family of 5. The Marble House needed 28. Rosecliff employed 32. Each servant represented a salary, a uniform, room and board, and the constant management required to keep a small army functioning invisibly. The housekeeper at the Elms oversaw 14 housemaids, 6 laundresses, 4 kitchen staff, 2 butlers, 3 footmen, 6 gardeners, and a night watchman. That was 50 people maintaining a home for 3. But the real cost was the arms race it created. Once one family built a ballroom that could host 400, the next had to build one for 500. Once one installed a marble staircase imported from a French chateau, the next had to commission one designed by a famous sculptor. The competition became self-sustaining and self-destructive, a race to bankruptcy disguised as a race to glory. The sisters understood this better than anyone. They were the ones managing the households, planning the entertainments, and deciding which rooms needed gold leaf and which could survive with mere silk wallpaper. And they knew that every dollar spent on their own mansion was a dollar that could make a rival's look shabby by comparison. So they pushed harder. Tessier Ulrichs spent $400,000 on a single ball in 1904. The theme was white, and she transformed Rosecliff into a fantasy of silk and light. White roses covered every surface. White peacocks wandered the gardens. White diamonds glittered on every woman. The evening was perfect. The photographs were stunning, and the message to her rivals was brutal. This is what I can afford to waste on a single night. But the mansions became prisons. The larger they grew, the more staff they required. The more staff they required, the more money they consumed. And the more money they consumed, the harder it became to maintain them when fortunes shifted. A mansion built to intimidate became a liability when the coal ran out or the railroad stocks collapsed. It became a monument to hubris that could not be sold because no one could afford to maintain it. The sisters learned too late that visibility was a trap. The mansion that announced your victory also announced your vulnerability. It told the world exactly how much you were spending and exactly how much you needed to keep spending to avoid looking desperate. It became a billboard advertising your decline the moment you could no longer keep every window lit and every garden manicured. By 1907, some of the grandest houses were already struggling. Rooms were closed to save on heating. Staff was reduced. Invitations were declined because the hostess could no longer afford the reciprocal entertainment. The facade held for a while, but the decay was visible to anyone who looked closely. Paint peeling, gardens overgrown, windows dark. And the sisters who had built those monuments to spite each other found themselves trapped inside them, unable to sell, unable to maintain, unable to admit that the war had bankrupted everyone. The warning had been built into the architecture from the beginning. A house designed to humiliate would eventually humiliate its owner. A mansion built on spite would collapse under the weight of its own excess. And a dynasty that measured worth in marble and gold would discover that those materials made beautiful ruins but terrible foundations. The charity that hid a knife. The donation was announced with tears, and every tear was a receipt meant to ruin someone. In 1892, Catherine Lorillard Wolfe rewrote the rules of philanthropic warfare. She pledged $200,000 to build a hospital wing, and she did it at a charity gala where her sister-in-law was seated in the second row. The announcement came with a speech about Christian duty and the suffering of the poor. The effect was a public shaming so precise it left no room for response. Because how do you compete with virtue? The sisters of the Gilded Age discovered that charity was the perfect weapon. It allowed you to drain the family fortune while looking saintly. It allowed you to claim moral superiority over siblings who spent on yachts instead of orphanages. And most importantly, it allowed you to rewrite history in real time by putting your name on institutions that would outlive the family feuds. The mechanics were simple and devastating. A sister with access to shared funds would announce a major donation without consulting the rest of the family. The amount would be large enough to hurt. The cause would be unimpeachable, and the announcement would be public enough that refusing to match it would look like heartlessness. The other sisters were trapped. Match the donation and drain your own resources, or refuse and be painted as selfish. Most matched, and then they escalated. In 1894, the Astor women turned competitive charity into a blood sport. Caroline Astor donated $100,000 to build a children's hospital. Her cousin Charlotte responded with $150,000 for a school. Caroline countered with $200,000 for a museum wing. The amounts climbed until both women were spending at a rate that required liquidating properties and investments to maintain appearances. The public loved it. The newspapers called them angels of mercy. Society pages praised their generosity. And neither woman could admit that the real goal was not helping strangers, but destroying family. The household budgets revealed the strategy's true cost. In 1896, the Vanderbilt family allocated $600,000 annually for household operations across their various estates. Staff salaries consumed $140,000, and maintenance and repairs took another $90,000. Food, wine, and entertainment required $120,000. But charitable pledges that year totaled $220,000, more than any other category except staff. The numbers expose the mathematics of moral warfare. A pledge of $50,000 to a hospital could be announced publicly with maximum glory. But it also meant reducing household staff by 15%, which meant closed rooms, fewer dinner parties, and visible decline. A donation of $100,000 could buy a library wing and your name in bronze, but it also meant selling a townhouse or a country estate to cover the pledge. The sisters who weaponized charity understood this calculus perfectly. They knew that forcing a rival to choose between matching a donation and looking cruel was a win either way. Match, and you bleed money. Refuse, and you bleed reputation. Either outcome advanced the war, but the cruelest version involved legacy control. In 1898, Margaret Emerson Van Allen announced a gift of $500,000 to Johns Hopkins Hospital with one condition. The wing would be named for her father, not her husband's family. The message was clear. She was rewriting the family narrative to center her bloodline, not theirs. Her in-laws could donate nothing and watch her father's name live forever in marble, or they could spend matching amounts and still be secondary. They chose to fight. The resulting pledges consumed 3 years of dividends and required selling property in 4 states. The hospital ended up with 2 wings, 2 names, and 2 families who would never speak again. The poor benefited. The dynasty fractured. and the newspapers wrote glowing profiles without ever asking why two families would destroy themselves over whose name appeared in bigger letters. The timeline of destruction was measurable. A major charity war typically lasted 18 to 36 months from first pledge to final payment. During that period, families would commit between $300,000 and $2 million, depending on their resources. But the true cost was not the money. It was the opportunity cost. Those funds could have been reinvested, diversified, or held as security against market downturns. Instead, they were locked into pledges that could not be rescinded without public humiliation. The staff understood what was happening before the families did. A housekeeper in a Gilded Age mansion could track the war by counting what disappeared. First, the annual bonuses vanished, then the Christmas gifts, then the raises, then positions went unfilled when servants retired, then salaries were delayed. The charitable pledges never stopped, but the people who kept the house running were the ones who paid for the war. Some households kept dual budgets. One showed public expenditures, including lavish charity. The other tracked private debt accumulation. The gap between them revealed the cost of reputation. A family might pledge $100,000 publicly while borrowing $80,000 privately to cover operations. As long as the pledges were fulfilled and the mansion stayed lit, the illusion held. But the debt compounded, and eventually the numbers stopped cooperating. By 1902, some of the most prominent charity warriors were quietly insolvent. Their names were on hospital wings and library buildings, but their bank accounts were empty. They had won the public relations war and lost the financial one. And because charity was irrevocable, there was no way to retreat without admitting the entire performance had been a lie. The sisters who survived were the ones who learned to use charity as a shield instead of a sword. They donated smaller amounts more consistently. They chose causes that required annual support instead of capital campaigns. And they never, ever made a pledge they could not afford without consulting their accountants first. But for the others, the ones who turned virtue into a competition, the ending was always the same. The hospital wing stood, the family fell, and the strangers who benefited from the war never knew what it had cost the people whose names were carved above the doors. The lesson was simple, but learned too late. You cannot bankrupt a rival through charity without bankrupting yourself. The weapon cuts both ways, and a dynasty that confuses revenge with virtue will discover that history remembers the buildings, not the feuds that funded them. The newspaper column that set fire. One sentence in print turned a private feud into a city-wide verdict, and the sisters never recovered their privacy. In January of 1897, Town Topics published a blind item that ended a family. The item was 23 words. It mentioned no names, but everyone who mattered knew exactly who it was about, and by the end of the week, the target's social life was over. This was the new battlefield, the society column. Before the rise of mass circulation newspapers, family scandals remained family property. A divorce could be managed quietly. An indiscretion could be contained with money. A feud could simmer for years without outsiders ever knowing the details. But the invention of the society page changed the equation. Now every ball, every wedding, every whispered rumor became potential content for a readership, hungry for aristocratic drama. And the sisters learned to use it. The mechanism was simple. Leak a story to a sympathetic columnist. Frame it carefully to suggest impropriety without stating anything actionable. Let the readers fill in the blanks. The target would be damaged before she even understood she had been attacked. and by the time she tried to respond, the narrative was already set. Town Topics perfected this dark art. Founded by William Dalton Mann, the magazine positioned itself as the insider's guide to high society. But its real business was blackmail dressed as journalism. Mann would approach a family with a damaging story. He would offer to kill it in exchange for a loan, an investment, or an advertisement. If they refused, the story ran. If they paid, it disappeared. Either way, Mann profited. The sisters who understood this system weaponized it ruthlessly. In March of 1898, Emily Post's mother-in-law leaked details of Emily's flirtation with a married banker. The item appeared in Town Topics, couched in careful language about a young matron whose behavior at a recent dinner party had raised eyebrows. Emily knew immediately who had fed the story. Her mother-in-law had been at that dinner. She had witnessed the conversation, and she had turned a moment of social charm into evidence of impropriety. The response was swift and surgical. Emily's allies leaked a counter-story. This one suggested her mother-in-law's charitable donations were actually attempts to cover gambling debts. The item appeared 2 weeks later, again in Town Topics, again in blind item format, again unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The two women never spoke again. The family split into factions, and the newspaper editors counted their advertising revenue. The chain reaction was predictable and unstoppable. Once one sister used the press, the others had no choice but to match. A rumor about fidelity prompted a counter-rumor about money. A suggestion of scandalous behavior triggered a leak about mental instability. An insinuation about a daughter's reputation demanded a retaliatory exposure of a son's drinking. The feuds metastasized from private to public, and the public could not get enough. By 1900, society journalism had become industrial scale. The New York Times ran society coverage daily. The Herald dedicated entire sections to parties and engagements. Town Topics, The Tatler, and a dozen imitators competed for the most salacious content. And the families who had once controlled information flow through private networks found themselves losing that control to editors who answered only to circulation numbers. The Vanderbilt divorce proved how total the transformation had become. When Alva Vanderbilt filed for divorce from William in 1895, she knew it would be public. What she did not anticipate was the feeding frenzy. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Editors assigned full-time staff to chase down rumors. Columnists speculated about settlement amounts, infidelity, and whether Alva would retain her social position post-divorce. The coverage was relentless, invasive, and completely beyond her control. The trial became theater. Newspapers printed testimony verbatim. They published sketches of the courtroom scene. They interviewed servants who claimed to have witnessed arguments. And they ran editorials debating whether a divorced woman could remain respectable, turning Alva's personal catastrophe into a referendum on female autonomy. The other sisters took notes. They saw what happened when you lost control of the narrative. They understood that once your name became content, you could never fully reclaim it. And they learned that the press was a weapon that could destroy you, even if you won your case in court. Because court records were public, divorce filings listed assets, custody disputes revealed private arguments, and all of it became fodder for reporters who had deadlines to meet and no loyalty to the families they covered. A sister could win her settlement and still lose her reputation if the newspapers decided her story sold papers. The Stuyvesant Fish family learned this in 1904 when a property dispute went to trial. The case was minor, a disagreement over a boundary line between estates. but the testimony revealed decades of family resentment. And sisters accused each other of theft. Cousins claimed they had been cheated out of inheritances, and every accusation was printed in the next day's papers, turning a legal formality into a public autopsy of a failed dynasty. The verdict did not matter. The family was destroyed before the judge even ruled, because the readers did not care about property lines. They cared about the drama of wealthy women hating each other enough to testify under oath about slights from childhood. That was the story. That was what sold papers. And once it was told, it could never be untold. The newspapers created a new kind of permanence. A scandal that might have faded from memory in a generation now lived forever in archived editions. A rumor that might have been disputed in private conversations was now set in print and stored in libraries. The sisters who weaponized the press created records of their own destruction. Some tried to fight back. They hired publicists to plant positive stories. They cultivated relationships with friendly editors. They sued for libel when coverage crossed legal lines. But the fundamental problem remained. The more they engaged with the press, the more material they provided. Every response became a new story. Every denial became evidence that there was something to deny. By 1910, the original goal was forgotten. The sisters were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting their own public images, losing battles against narratives they could not control. The society pages had become archives of failure, and every family feud was now part of the permanent record. The family name, which had once been their most valuable asset, became their greatest liability. Because now it was not just a name, it was a story, and the story was no longer theirs to tell. The will rewrite that started war. The lawyer entered the library at dusk, and by morning the house belonged to a different future. In October of 1903, railroad heiress Mary Wetmore summoned her attorney to her Newport estate. She was 81 years old, bedridden, and convinced that her daughters were plotting against her. The attorney arrived with a new will. By dawn, 3 daughters had been disinherited, and a 4th had inherited everything. This was the nuclear option, the will rewrite. For all the damage sisters could do through social exclusion and newspaper leaks, nothing matched the finality of changing inheritance terms. A will was a legal weapon that functioned after death, which meant the target could never respond, never defend, never reconcile. It was revenge that outlasted life itself. The mechanics required only 2 things: access to the parent and a compliant lawyer. In the Gilded Age, elder care meant control. The daughter who lived closest, who visited most often, who managed the household staff, was the daughter who controlled information flow. She decided which visitors were allowed. She filtered which letters reached her mother's hands. And she shaped the narrative about which children were loyal and which had abandoned the family. This proximity became a siege weapon. A sister could isolate a parent slowly, methodically, without ever appearing cruel. She would suggest that certain visitors tired mother out. She would mention that certain letters seemed to upset father. She would hire staff loyal to her, doctors who reported to her, and accountants who shared ledgers only with her. And gradually, the parent would hear only one version of family history. The version that made one daughter a saint and the others traitors. The competing sisters had few options once the siege began. They could not visit without permission. They could not write without their letters being intercepted. They could not even confirm their parents' health without going through the gatekeeper daughter. And any attempt to break through the barrier looked like aggression, which only reinforced the narrative that they were the problem. The Schermerhorn case demonstrated how thoroughly this strategy could work. In 1905, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's 3 daughters battled over their mother's final years. The eldest daughter, Emily, lived in the Newport mansion and managed her mother's care. The other 2 lived in New York and visited when allowed. Over 3 years, Emily slowly convinced her mother that the other daughters were ungrateful, money-hungry, and plotting to have her declared incompetent. By the time the mother died in 1908, the will had been rewritten 4 times. Each version gave Emily more control. The final version placed the Newport estate, the Manhattan townhouse, and the bulk of the securities into a trust managed by Emily with almost unlimited discretion. The other daughters received fixed annuities that could not be increased and could be revoked if they challenged the will. They challenged anyway. The legal machinery of will contests was elaborate and expensive. The challengers had to prove either undue influence, meaning the favored child had manipulated the parent, or incompetence, meaning the parent lacked the mental capacity to make sound decisions. Both claims required medical testimony, witness statements, and often the testimony of servants who had been present during private family moments. The Schermerhorn contest involved 11 attorneys, 4 physicians, 17 servants who testified, and 32 depositions taken over 14 months. The legal fees exceeded $200,000. The newspaper coverage was daily, and the testimony revealed decades of resentment packaged as evidence. One daughter claimed her mother had been drugged. Medical records showed morphine for pain management, which was standard, but the daughter insisted the doses proved incompetence. Another daughter brought servants who testified that Emily had prevented visits and intercepted mail. Emily countered with servants who swore the other daughters never visited and only appeared when money was discussed. The estate itself became a ledger of absurdity. The Newport property alone was valued at $1.2 million. The Manhattan townhouse at $800,000. Securities and bonds totaled $3.7 million. But the estate also held debts of $600,000, most of them from loans taken against future inheritances by daughters who assumed their mother would live forever. The trust structures added complexity. The will created 4 separate trusts, one for Emily with full control, 3 for the other daughters with locked terms, and named trustees who happened to be Emily's allies. The income from the trusts was substantial, averaging $40,000 per daughter annually, but access to principal required approval from Emily's appointed board. The case dragged through 3 levels of court over 41 months. The newspapers published every accusation. Cousins took sides. Grandchildren were called to testify about which grandmother they preferred. And the legal system ground forward with procedural delays, appeals, and motions that consumed more money than any of the daughters would ultimately receive. The verdict, when it finally came, satisfied no one. The court upheld the will, but required Emily to provide accounting. The other daughters kept their trusts, but lost all claims to real property. Legal fees consumed $900,000 of estate value, and the family, in which had entered the contest as fractured, emerged as destroyed. But the real damage was not financial, it was reputational, because everything said in depositions was now public record. Every claim of manipulation, every accusation of greed, every piece of dirty family history was now archived and searchable. Future generations would read these documents and learn that their great-grandmothers had hated each other enough to lie under oath. The pattern repeated across dozens of families. The Belmont sisters fought over their father's railroad fortune for 6 years. The Jerome daughters litigated their mother's estate through 2 decades. The Goulet family spent a generation in court over whether one sister had forged a codicil. Every case followed the same arc: initial filing, escalating rhetoric, servants weaponized, medical records disputed, character assassination disguised as testimony, and finally a settlement that left everyone poorer and angrier than when they started. The attorneys were the only winners. A complex estate contest could generate fees exceeding 30% of the total value. Lawyers learned to prolong cases through procedural tactics that looked legitimate but served mainly to run up billable hours. And the families, desperate to win, paid without question, because losing meant admitting they had been wrong about everything. By 1915, will contests had become so common that the legal profession developed specialists, attorneys who did nothing but represent families fighting over inheritance. They knew the doctors who would testify to incompetence. They knew the handwriting experts who could dispute signatures. They knew exactly how to turn family dysfunction into evidence. And the sisters kept hiring them. Because a will rewrite was not just about money. It was about being right. About proving you were the loved one, the loyal one, the one who deserved to inherit the name along with the fortune. And that need to be validated, to be chosen, to win, mattered more than the cost. The final irony was predictable. Most will contests destroyed more wealth than they preserved. The legal fees, the years of frozen assets, the inability to reinvest or adapt to changing markets meant that even the winners received less than they would have if they had simply accepted the original terms. But acceptance was never the point. Victory was the point. And victory required lawyers, courtrooms, and the absolute certainty that your sister was the enemy. Though the winter nobody paid the staff. The chandeliers still glittered, but the servants stopped being paid, and the silence inside the house became louder than any scandal. In December of 1907, the staff at Ogden Mills's Fifth Avenue mansion gathered in the servants' hall to discuss a problem. Their wages were 6 weeks late. The housekeeper had been making excuses. The butler had been promising resolutions. But the truth was becoming undeniable. The money was gone. This was how collapse looked from the inside. While the society pages still covered balls and the mansion still hosted dinners, the machinery that made those events possible was quietly shutting down. Servants went unpaid. Suppliers stopped extending credit. Tradesmen demanded cash before delivering goods. And the families who had spent a generation fighting each other suddenly faced a common enemy: insolvency. The staff knew first because they lived in the house and saw what the guests never did. They saw which rooms were closed to save on heating. They noticed when the silver plate started replacing actual silver at table settings. They tracked which paintings disappeared from hallways, sold quietly through dealers to raise cash. And they understood that when their wages stopped, the family was not temporarily short. The family was finished. The wages themselves told the story of the hierarchy. A head butler earned $80 to $100 per month. A housekeeper, $60 to $75. A lady's maid, $40 to $50. Footmen and parlor maids, $30. Kitchen staff, $20 to $25. Laundresses, $15. A large household with 30 servants consumed approximately $1,800 monthly in wages alone, or $21,600 annually. But wages were only part of the cost. Uniforms had to be provided, room and board calculated separately, medical care when servants fell ill, replacement costs when staff left. and the constant management required to keep dozens of people functioning invisibly. The total operational cost of a fully staffed mansion ran between $60,000 and $80,000 annually just for personnel. When the money stopped flowing, the collapse followed a predictable sequence. First, the bonuses disappeared, then the annual raises, then the Christmas gifts. Then wages were delayed a week, then 2, then a month. Staff began leaving, not dramatically, but quietly, finding positions in households that still had cash flow. The remaining servants absorbed additional duties. One housekeeper managed tasks that once required 3. The butler doubled as footman. The lady's maid helped with cooking. The families tried to maintain appearances. They kept hosting events but scaled down. A dinner for 50 instead of 200. Local flowers instead of imports. House wine instead of vintage champagne. And they hoped no one would notice that the army of servants had shrunk to a skeleton crew, working double shifts to preserve the illusion. But society noticed everything. The guests counted footmen. They evaluated wine vintages. They assessed flower arrangements. And they gossiped ruthlessly about families whose standards had declined. A hostess who served domestic champagne was marked as struggling. A mansion with only 2 footmen instead of 6 was clearly cutting costs. And a family that declined invitations because they could not afford reciprocal entertainment was finished. Some families tried to keep selected rooms perfect while letting others decay. The ballroom stayed heated and lit for events, but bedrooms went cold. The front entrance gleamed with polish, but back hallways gathered dust. The dining room table seated 20 in splendor, while the kitchen operated on a budget meant for a middle-class household. The staff lived this bifurcated reality daily. They maintained the facade in public spaces while witnessing the decay everywhere else. They pressed silk gowns that would be worn to events where dinner cost more than their annual wages. They polished silver that would be sold next month to pay creditors. And they smiled and said nothing because their employment depended on protecting the family's secrets. But secrets became harder to keep as the decline accelerated. Tradesmen who had been patient for months eventually filed suit for unpaid bills. The grocers, the wine merchants, the florists, the dressmakers all had ledgers showing mounting debt. And once those suits became public record, the gossip was unstoppable. A family that could not pay its grocer was a family in crisis, and no amount of social graces could hide that fact. The liquidation began quietly. First, the minor pieces. A landscape painting no one would miss. A set of china used only for the largest events. A carriage the family claimed they no longer needed. The sales were handled privately through dealers who understood discretion was part of the service. But eventually, the major pieces had to go. In April of 1909, the Livingston family put their Newport estate up for auction. The catalog ran to 87 pages. It listed 342 lots, including furniture, paintings, sculpture, silver, porcelain, rugs, and decorative objects. The estimated total value was $600,000. The actual sale realized $310,000. The discrepancy revealed the brutal mathematics of forced sales. When the market knew you were desperate, prices collapsed. Dealers colluded to keep bids low. Collectors waited for bargains, and items that had been appraised at $10,000 sold for $4,000. The family needed $600,000 to clear their debts. They received $310,000 and still owed the difference. The auction catalog became an autopsy report. Each lot told a story. Lot 47, a set of Louis XV chairs purchased in Paris in 1892 for $12,000, sold for $3,500. Lot 93, a Gainsborough portrait that had hung in the entrance hall for 2 decades, sold for $8,000 against an appraisal of $25,000. Lot 160, a Sèvres dinner service for $48,000, sold for $2,000, roughly the cost of 2 months of servant wages. The buyers were often rivals. Families who had lost social battles decades earlier now appeared at auctions to purchase the spoils. They bid on portraits of ancestors they did not share. They bought furniture that had furnished the ballrooms where they had been snubbed. And they did it publicly, ensuring everyone knew exactly who had fallen and who had risen. The emotional cost was harder to quantify, but easier to observe. Staff who had worked for a family for decades watched strangers carry away objects they had cleaned and cared for. A housekeeper who had polished a particular set of candlesticks every week for 20 years saw them sold for $40 to a dealer who would resell them for $80. A butler who had served wine from a specific decanter at hundreds of dinners watched it get cataloged, lotted, and auctioned. Some families tried to hide the decline by moving. They claimed they were simplifying or spending more time abroad. They sold the Fifth Avenue mansion but kept a smaller townhouse. They closed the Newport estate but maintained a cottage. And they hoped the narrative of voluntary downsizing would prevent the truth from spreading. It never worked, because the staff talked, the tradesmen talked, the auctioneers talked, and the society reporters who attended every major sale wrote detailed accounts of who had fallen and by how much. The Gilded Age had created an information network that was impossible to escape once you entered the public record of decline. By 1912, dozens of the grandest houses were struggling. Some were sold intact to new money families desperate for social credentials. Others were subdivided into apartments. A few were demolished when even maintenance costs exceeded their value. And the families that had built them were scattered to smaller homes, cheaper neighborhoods, and the slow erasure of forgotten names. The staff remembered, though. They remembered when the wages were paid on time and the house ran smoothly. They remembered when 30 people worked together to create perfection for guests who noticed nothing. They remembered the moment it all stopped. The first delayed paycheck, the first apologetic excuse, the first quiet departure of a colleague who found better prospects. And they remembered that the families who had once seemed invincible were just as vulnerable as anyone else when the money ran out. The courtroom where sisters lied. They swore oaths with calm voices, then contradicted each other so precisely it sounded rehearsed, because it was. In February of 1914, 3 sisters sat in a Manhattan courtroom and destroyed each other under oath. The case was a trust dispute. The testimony was a referendum on 30 years of accumulated hatred. And the performance was so polished, it suggested all 3 had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. The trial structure forced intimacy. Unlike charity wars or social exclusions, a courtroom required direct confrontation. The sisters could not avoid each other. They could not send proxies. They had to sit in the same room, listen to accusations, and respond with their own version of reality. And every word was recorded by stenographers who would preserve the testimony forever. The plaintiff was Margaret, the eldest, who claimed her sisters had conspired with their mother's doctor to alter a trust document while their mother was sedated after surgery. The defendants were Eleanor and Catherine, who claimed Margaret had stolen jewelry, forged signatures on household accounts, and invented the entire lawsuit to cover her own embezzlement. All three were lying. The question was only about which lies were provable. The attorneys began with character assassination disguised as context. Margaret's lawyer asked Eleanor about her gambling. Eleanor's lawyer asked Catherine about her debts. Catherine's lawyer asked Margaret about her history of nervous collapse. None of it was relevant to the trust dispute. All of it was designed to make the jury doubt everything the sisters said. The testimony followed a pattern. One sister would describe an event. Another would describe the same event with opposite conclusions. And the third would claim the event never happened at all. A family dinner became either a pleasant evening, a hostile confrontation, or a complete fiction, depending on who was speaking. Margaret testified that she visited her mother daily during her final illness. Eleanor testified that Margaret visited once and was asked to leave. Catherine testified that Margaret was banned from visiting after she tried to steal morphine from the medicine cabinet. All three provided dates, times, and witnesses. All three were absolutely certain. And all three could not possibly be telling the truth. The servants were weaponized with surgical precision. Each sister had cultivated relationships with different staff members over the years, and now those relationships became evidence. Margaret called the former housekeeper, who testified that Eleanor and Catherine had prevented visits, and Eleanor called the lady's maid, who testified that Margaret had been caught going through their mother's private papers. Catherine called the night nurse, who testified that all three sisters had tried to influence medical treatment. The cross-examinations revealed the strategy. Every servant had been promised something: a letter of recommendation, a severance payment, help finding a new position, and in exchange, they agreed to testify to a version of events that supported one sister's narrative. The servants were not lying exactly. They were selecting which truths to emphasize and which to omit. The medical records became a battlefield. Margaret's team presented evidence that their mother was heavily medicated during the trust revision. They had prescription logs, dosage records, and a physician who testified the medications could impair judgment. Eleanor and Catherine's team presented the same records and a different physician who testified the dosages were therapeutic and appropriate. Both experts were credible. Both had reviewed the same files, and both reached opposite conclusions based on which side was paying them. The timeline of the trust revision was disputed minute by minute. Margaret claimed the document was signed at 4 p.m. when their mother was post-surgical and sedated. Eleanor produced a notary who swore the signing occurred at 11 a.m. when their mother was alert. Catherine provided a letter their mother allegedly wrote that same evening, describing the signing as her own decision. The handwriting experts were brought in. One testified the letter signature matched thousands of other signatures from the same period. Another testified the letter signature showed signs of tremor consistent with coercion or sedation. Both experts had credentials. Both had analyzed the same samples. And both were absolutely certain of contradictory conclusions. The strategy was transparent, but effective. Drown the jury in competing expert opinions until they could not determine what was true. Create so much doubt that any verdict became arbitrary, and ensure that even if one side won legally, all sides lost reputationally. The financial details revealed the stakes. The disputed trust-controlled assets, worth approximately $2.4 million, generating annual income of roughly $96,000. The trust document specified that income should be divided among the three sisters, with Margaret receiving administrative fees. The disputed revision changed the split from equal thirds to 40% for Eleanor and Catherine combined, and 60% for Margaret. That 20% difference was worth $19,000 annually. Over a lifetime, it could mean a difference of $500,000. That was the amount for which these sisters were willing to destroy each other in public. The trial consumed 6 weeks. 137 witnesses testified. 4,000 pages of transcript were generated. The jury deliberated for 11 hours, and the verdict satisfied no one because it could not resolve the underlying question: which sister was telling the truth? The jury ruled the trust revision was valid, but reduced Margaret's administrative fees and imposed oversight. Margaret won control, but not vindication. Eleanor and Catherine lost financially, but could claim moral victory by proving Margaret had overreached. And all three left the courtroom branded as liars who had weaponized their mother's death. The legal costs consumed the victory. Margaret's team charged $80,000. Eleanor and Catherine's team charged $72,000. Court costs, expert fees, and transcript preparation added another $28,000. The total of $180,000 was roughly 2 years of the trust's total income. They had spent 2 years of their inheritance destroying each other. But the financial cost was minor compared to the social cost, because everything said in that courtroom was now public. The gambling debts, the morphine accusations, the claims of forgery and theft. All of it was reported in newspapers that treated the trial as entertainment. The sisters had provided 6 weeks of content, and the papers had rewarded them with permanent infamy. The pattern repeated across the Gilded Age. The Gould sisters fought over their father's railroad empire for 9 years. The Mackay daughters litigated their mother's jewels through 3 trials. The Astor cousins spent a decade in court over a disputed codicil, and every trial followed the same script: strategic lies, weaponized servants, competing experts, and families destroyed for sums that seemed enormous until you calculated what the fight had cost. Some families tried to settle before trial, but settlement required compromise, and compromise required one side admitting they were wrong. Neither side would yield. Both believed they deserved total victory, and both were willing to spend anything to achieve it. The attorneys encouraged this thinking because it served their interests. A settled case generated flat fees. A trial generated months of billable hours at premium rates. The longer the fight lasted, the more everyone earned except the families funding it. By the time most cases reached verdict, the original dispute was forgotten. The fight had become about winning, about being right, about proving the other sisters were lying criminals who deserved nothing. The trust or will or property that started the war was just the excuse. The real prize was total victory, but total victory was impossible because the system was designed for partial outcomes. The jury could not determine who was lying and who was telling the truth when everyone was doing both. They could only split the difference, impose compromise, and hope the families learned something from the experience. They never did, because the lesson the sisters learned was not that litigation was destructive. It was that litigation was necessary. That the only way to protect yourself from family was to preemptively attack them in court. That trust was weakness and paranoia was strategy, and that the courtroom was the only place left where you could force your siblings to listen to your version of reality. The transcripts remained. Thousands of pages of testimony that would outlive everyone involved. If future generations would read them and learn exactly how much these women hated each other, They would see the contradictions, the strategic lies, and the willingness to destroy family for percentages of income. And they would ask the same question juries asked. Why? Why spend 2 years of inheritance on a fight? Why risk everything for 20% more? The answer was never about the money. It was about being chosen, about proving you were the favorite, the loyal one, the daughter who deserved to win. And that need for validation, that desperate hunger to be right, mattered more than any amount of wealth. So they lied under oath, they destroyed each other in public, and they called it justice. The auction that erased a name. When the hammer fell, it did not just sell objects, it sold the last illusion that the dynasty was permanent. On March 12, 1919, the American Art Association held a 4-day auction at the Anderson Galleries in New York. The catalog title was discreet, property from a distinguished estate. But everyone knew whose estate. The Belmont family was selling everything. This was the endgame, the final liquidation, the moment when private identity became public merchandise. The catalog ran to 216 pages. It listed 943 lots, furniture from 7 different residences, paintings collected over 3 generations, silver services used at state dinners, tapestries that had hung in ballrooms where presidents and princes had danced, and personal items so intimate their sale felt like grave robbing. Lot 17 was a set of nursery furniture. Lot 93 was a wedding dress. In Lot 204 was a collection of children's books with inscriptions from grandmother to grandchild. These were not investments. These were memories. And they were being sold to strangers who would never know or care about the lives they represented. The viewing attracted thousands. The auction itself was invitation only, limited to 500 bidders who had demonstrated financial capacity. But the press covered it like a royal funeral. Reporters described which items attracted the most attention. Photographers documented the crowd, and society columnists wrote elegies for a family that had once seemed untouchable. The prices told competing stories. Some items exceeded estimates, driven by collectors who wanted a piece of Gilded Age mythology. A Boule cabinet estimated at $8,000 sold for $14,000. A Gobelin tapestry estimated at $12,000 reached $18,000. These were trophy purchases by families ascending who wanted artifacts from families descending. But most items sold below estimate. A Sèvres dinner service appraised at $6,000 realized $2,800. A library of first editions estimated at $15,000 brought $9,000. The portraits, which the family had assumed would command premium prices, mostly failed to meet reserves. Nobody wanted paintings of strangers' ancestors. The 4-day sale realized $873,000. The pre-sale estimate had been $1.4 million. The difference represented the discount the market applied to desperation. The auctioneers took a 15% commission. Legal fees for settling the estate consumed another $90,000. Debts and back taxes took $600,000. The remaining $168,000 was split among 7 surviving family members. Each received $24,000, a rounding error compared to what the family had once controlled, but the financial loss was minor compared to the symbolic one. Because the auction made the decline official. As long as the family still owned the objects, they could pretend they still had options. They could claim they were downsizing by choice, simplifying, adapting to modern times. The auction destroyed that pretense. It announced to the world that the Belmonts were finished and selling everything to pay debts. The staff attended. Many had worked for the family for decades. They watched furniture they had polished and paintings they had dusted get sold to strangers. A housekeeper bid on a small side table she had cleaned every week for 23 years. She won it for $19. It was the only piece of the house she would ever own. Some items carried whispered stories. Lot 412 was a writing desk where 3 generations of women had composed letters, managed households, and planned the social campaigns that had once defined New York. It sold for $420 to a dealer who planned to resell it as a generic antique. Lot 608 was a necklace worn by the matriarch at her daughter's wedding, her granddaughter's debut, and dozens of charity galas where she had been photographed and admired. It sold for $8,000 to a collector who would never wear it and never know its history. The curse whispers started during the viewing. Staff and rivals murmured that the family had been doomed from the start, that their rapid rise guaranteed rapid fall, that houses built on railroad money and society battles could never last. The stories accumulated. A daughter who died young, a son who drank himself to death, a grandson who never married, a great-granddaughter institutionalized. The evidence suggested a pattern if you wanted to see one, but the grounded truth was simpler and colder. The Belmonts had spent 3 generations confusing income with wealth. They had assumed the money would last forever because it had lasted their entire lives. They had fought each other for larger shares without asking whether the total was sustainable. And they had built their identity around objects and status that could be liquidated in 4 days. The railroads that funded the dynasty had been sold, consolidated, and regulated into diminished profitability. The trusts that should have protected principal had been raided for current expenses. The children who should have managed assets had been raised to spend, not invest. And the lawyers and bankers who should have provided discipline had been fired whenever they delivered inconvenient advice. The auction was not a curse, it was a reckoning. The pattern was visible across dozens of families. The Jeromes auctioned in 1921, the Livingstons in 1923, the Goulets in 1926. Each sale followed the same script: multi-day event, elaborate catalog, press coverage framing it as the end of an era, disappointing results, and families who had once ruled society reduced to fractions of their former wealth. The buyers were often new money, families who had made fortunes in war industries, automobiles, or Hollywood. They wanted the furniture and art that would make them look established. They wanted the social credentials that came from owning objects that had belonged to famous families. And they were willing to pay premium prices for certain items while ignoring others. The calculus was clear. A painting with provenance showing it had hung in a Vanderbilt mansion was worth 3 times what the same painting would bring with no history. A dining table used at Astor dinners commanded more than an identical table from unknown origins. The buyers were not purchasing quality, they were purchasing association with a lost world. But that world was genuinely lost. The auction marked a transition point. The families that had defined the Gilded Age were being replaced by families who admired them but could never replicate them. The new money could buy the objects, but not the history. They could hire the same decorators, but not command the same deference. They could host parties in the same houses, but never achieve the same mystique. The Belmont auction catalog became a document of cultural archaeology. Researchers would study it to understand how Gilded Age families lived. Students would analyze it to track the flow of art and antiques through American collecting. And descendants would page through it, searching for items they recognized from photographs, trying to reconstruct a world that existed now only in auction records. The verdict on the curse remained open because both explanations were true. Yes, the family had been unlucky. Untimely deaths, bad investments, children who struggled. But also, yes, the family had been reckless, spending without restraint, fighting without strategy, trusting that status would protect them from consequences. The supernatural and the structural were not competing theories. They were complementary. The curse was real if you defined curse as the inevitable result of choices made without regard for sustainability. The family destroyed itself, and that self-destruction looked enough like fate that observers could call it cursed without being wrong. The hammer fell on lot 943 at 6:15 in the evening on March 15th. The crowd applauded. The auctioneers thanked the bidders, and the Belmont name, which had once opened doors across 2 continents, became a footnote in someone else's catalog. The staff collected their severance. The family scattered to smaller homes, and the objects that had defined their identity found new homes with people who would never understand what they had meant. The exile disguised as travel. She told friends she was leaving for Europe, but everyone knew she was fleeing a city that would not forget. In September of 1920, Margaret Livingston booked passage on a steamer to France. She told her remaining social circle she wanted to experience Paris in autumn. She told her lawyer she needed distance to heal. But the truth was simpler and sadder. New York had become unbearable, and exile was her only option. This was the aftermath. The quiet disappearance of women who had lost the war. The pattern was predictable. First came the trial, or the scandal, or the public humiliation. Then came the period of attempted recovery, where the defeated sister tried to maintain her position through willpower and denial. And finally came the realization that the city would never forget, never forgive, and never let her reclaim what she had lost. So she left. The destinations were always presented as choices: Paris for culture, London for society, Rome for art, the French Riviera for health. But the real reason was always distance, far enough that the gossip could not follow, far enough that strangers would not recognize the name, far enough that she could pretend to be someone else. Margaret settled in a small apartment on the left bank. Nothing like the mansion she had left behind. 3 rooms, a single servant, furniture that looked elegant but cost little. She joined an expatriate social circle of other displaced women, Americans who had left for reasons they never fully explained, divorcees, widows, daughters of failed fortunes. They understood each other without needing to discuss specifics. They all knew what it meant to be unable to return home. They all carried the weight of being from somewhere that no longer wanted them. And they all performed the fiction that they had chosen this life instead of having it forced upon them. The financial reality was brutal. Margaret had left New York with an annuity of $4,500 per year. In Paris, this was enough for modest comfort, but nothing resembling the life she had known. She could afford a small apartment, but not a house. A single servant, but not staff. Ready-made clothing, but not couture. She could attend the opera from the cheap seats, but not from a box. The scale of reduction was measurable. In New York, her household budget had been $6,000 monthly. In Paris, it was $375. She had gone from employing 16 people to employing 1. From maintaining multiple residences to renting 3 rooms. From hosting dinners for 50 to accepting invitations from others because she could not afford to reciprocate. The expatriate community had its own hierarchy. Women with larger annuities lived in better arrondissements. Women with remaining jewelry could pawn pieces when cash flow tightened. Women with family connections still had access to certain circles. Margaret had none of these advantages. Her annuity was fixed. Her jewelry had been sold to pay legal fees, and her family name, which had once opened doors, now marked her as someone who had lost a spectacular public fight. She tried to reinvent herself. She took French lessons. She attended lectures. She claimed she was writing a memoir, though she never produced pages. These were activities designed to fill time and provide answers when new acquaintances asked what she did. Because admitting she did nothing except wait for her quarterly annuity payment would have been too honest. The other exiled sisters faced similar constraints. Some fared better with larger settlements or inherited property that generated income. Some fared worse when families cut them off completely, or annuities proved insufficient for even basic needs. All of them learned that being from a famous family meant nothing when you could no longer afford to live like one. The timeline of reputation loss was surprisingly fast. Within 3 years, Margaret was forgotten in New York social circles. The hostesses who had once competed for her attendance stopped sending invitations. The society pages stopped mentioning her name, and the next generation of debutantes had never heard of her. She learned this through letters from the few friends who maintained contact. They wrote about parties she would have attended, events she would have hosted, scandals involving people she had known, and their letters made clear that life in New York had continued without her. She had not left a void. She had simply been replaced. Some exiles attempted returns. They would book passage back to New York, rent a small apartment, and try to re-enter society. It never worked. The city remembered what they wanted to forget. Old rivals ensured they were excluded from important events. Hostesses who had taken sides in forgotten feuds maintained those positions, and the returning exile discovered that absence had not made anyone's heart grow fonder. Margaret tried once in 1924. She stayed 6 weeks. She attended 3 events to which she managed to secure invitations. And she realized that the women she had once considered peers now treated her with polite distance. They were kind, but not warm, welcoming, but not inclusive. They made space for her in the room, but not in the conversation. She returned to Paris and never attempted the trip again. The properties they left behind told stories of their own. Margaret's Fifth Avenue townhouse was sold to pay debts and became a private club. Her Newport cottage was purchased by new money and redecorated to remove all traces of the previous owner. The summer house in the Adirondacks was demolished when no buyer could be found. Within a decade, there was no physical evidence she had ever owned anything in New York. The children who inherited the war faced their own choices. Some maintained contact with exiled mothers and aunts. Others cut ties completely, believing that association with the defeated would damage their own prospects. And some tried to broker reconciliation between feuding sisters, only to discover that the wounds were too deep and the pride too strong. Margaret's daughter visited once per year. The visits were dutiful, but not warm. They spoke about safe topics, the weather, French politics, books they were reading, but they never discussed the trial, never mentioned the family they had left behind, never addressed the fact that the daughter's marriage prospects had been damaged by her mother's public defeat. The guilt was unspoken, but present. Margaret knew her fights had cost her children opportunities. The daughter knew but could not say that she resented being collateral damage. So they had tea, made small talk, and counted the hours until the visit could end. The final accounting was simple and sad. Margaret had started with a fortune, a name, and a position. She had spent 30 years fighting sisters over inheritance terms and social precedents. And she had ended with a small apartment in Paris, an annuity barely sufficient for modest comfort, and children who visited out of obligation rather than love. She died in 1933. The obituary in the New York Times was 4 sentences. It listed her birth, her marriage, and her survival by 2 children. It made no mention of the family she had come from or the fight she had waged. She had become, in death as in exile, simply another forgotten name. The other exiles followed similar paths. Some lasted longer, some died sooner, but all of them shared the experience of being erased from the cities they had once dominated. Their names disappeared from social registers. Their faces faded from photographs in society page archives. And their stories became cautionary tales told by descendants who wanted to avoid the same fate. The lesson was clear but rarely learned. You could win every battle and still lose the war if victory required destroying everything that made winning worthwhile. Margaret had defeated her sisters in court, but she had lost her home, her position, and her relevance. And in the end, exile was just another word for surrender. The children who inherited the war. The daughters and sons did not inherit just money. They inherited sides, and each side came with a price. In 1935, 2 cousins met accidentally at a Paris hotel. They recognized each other immediately, despite not having spoken in 15 years. Their mothers were sisters who had fought a will contest that destroyed the family fortune and fractured every relationship. The cousins stood in the lobby, exchanged awkward pleasantries, and moved on without suggesting they should stay in touch. This was the inheritance, not money, division. The next generation received trust funds diminished by legal fees and poor management, but they also received something more toxic. They received maps of who was family and who was enemy. They received instructions about which cousins to acknowledge and which to shun. They received the unspoken command to continue fights they had not started over insults they had not experienced. Some obeyed, others rebelled, but none escaped the weight of being born into a war zone. The obedient children carried the feud forward. They refused invitations to events where hostile family members might attend. They supported one version of family history and rejected all others. They maintained silence with half the family tree and pretended entire branches did not exist. And they raised their own children with the same divisions, and passing the animosity to a 3rd generation that had even less context for why they were supposed to hate people they had never met. The rebellious children tried to make peace. They reached out to estranged cousins. They attended family events on both sides. They refused to pick teams in fights that had ended before they were born. And they discovered that peacemaking was interpreted as betrayal by the generation that had done the original fighting. A son who invited cousins from both sides to his wedding would be accused of disloyalty. A daughter who tried to broker reconciliation between feuding aunts would be told she did not understand what had been done. The children who sought unity were punished for it by both sides because unity threatened the narrative each faction had built about being right. The marriage choices revealed the depth of the damage. Some children married specifically to repair family rifts. A daughter from one faction would marry a son from another in hopes that the union would heal divisions. It never worked. The wedding became another battlefield where seating charts became political statements and speeches were analyzed for coded insults. Other children married to escape. They chose spouses from entirely different social circles. Middle-class professionals, artists, foreigners, anyone who had no connection to Gilded Age dynasties and no interest in family feuds. These marriages offered freedom, but at the cost of confirming their parents' fears that the next generation had abandoned the family project entirely. And some children never married at all. They had watched their parents weaponize marriage and concluded that intimacy was too dangerous. Better to stay single than to risk creating another generation that would inherit another version of the same war. The career choices followed similar patterns. Sons who were expected to manage family investments often chose other paths: law or medicine or academia. Anything that did not require them to sit across from relatives in boardrooms and negotiate trust distributions while pretending civility. They took the trust income but refused the family business. Daughters who should have become social leaders often withdrew entirely. They moved to smaller cities or foreign countries. They pursued education or careers that would have scandalized their mothers. They deliberately chose obscurity over visibility because they had seen what happened when your name appeared in newspapers. The family records reflected the generational decay. In 1880, the combined wealth of one dynasty might total $20 million across a dozen family members. By 1920, that same family would control $8 million, divided among 40 members after legal fees. Poor investments and sustained consumption had eroded the base. By 1960, the third generation would inherit 2 million split 80 ways, with most individual shares too small to matter. The timeline showed the mathematics of division. A fortune that seemed infinite when concentrated in one generation became modest when split among children and negligible when divided among grandchildren. Add in sustained spending, illegal battles and investment losses, and the exponential decay was predictable. But the emotional inheritance was harder to quantify and took longer to dissipate. A grandchild born in 1940 would grow up hearing stories about great aunts who destroyed each other in court. She would learn to avoid certain cousins without understanding why. She would be told that her grandmother had been wronged by her grandmother's sister, but the details would be vague and the grievance ancient, and she would face a choice. Continue the pattern or break it. Most broke it through indifference. They accepted their small trust distributions and ignored the family drama. They did not attend reunions. They did not maintain grudges. They simply opted out of a game they had never agreed to play. This was not forgiveness. It was exhaustion. The feuds had gone on so long and meant so little to people who had not experienced the original wounds that continuation required more energy than anyone was willing to invest. But some continued the pattern. They learned the family grievances and adopted them as their own. They taught their children to distrust certain branches of the family tree. They maintained the social divisions, even as the money that had motivated them disappeared. And they proved that inheritance was not just financial, it was psychological. The sealed family records documented the slow dissolution. Wills filed in probate courts showed declining assets and increasing complexity. A will from 1890 might be 12 pages disposing of a clear fortune. A will from 1940 would be 40 pages managing trusts, restrictions, and provisions designed to prevent fighting while actually ensuring it. The contested estates of the second generation revealed the same patterns as the first. Daughters accused each other of undue influence. Sons claimed siblings had stolen heirlooms, and lawyers generated fees that consumed whatever value remained. But the amounts were smaller. The fights were about 50,000 instead of 5 million. The stakes had declined even as the animosity remained constant. By the third generation, some families had nothing left to fight over. The trust was exhausted. The properties were sold. The heirlooms were auctioned. And the descendants were left with nothing but stories about wealth they had never seen and grudges they had inherited from people they had never met. The generational impact was measurable in lost opportunities. Children who grew up in fractured families had fewer connections, less social capital, and diminished prospects. They could not call on cousins for business opportunities because half the cousins were forbidden contacts. They could not access family networks because the networks had been destroyed by feuds. The scale of destruction across multiple generations was staggering. One dynasty might have started with 20 million in 1880 and 30 living members. By 2020, that same family would have 200 living descendants, sharing assets worth perhaps 2 million total. The per capita inheritance had gone from 666,000 to 10,000 over 4 generations. The family name remained, but it meant nothing. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared a surname that once commanded respect, but they worked ordinary jobs, lived in ordinary circumstances, and had no connection to the world their ancestors had dominated. Some tried to preserve memory through family associations or historical societies. They would gather every 5 years to share stories and maintain genealogies. But attendance declined with each generation as descendants had less in common than surnames. The reunions became sad performances of connection that no longer existed. The final irony was predictable. The fights that had seemed so important, so worth destroying relationships over, had been about money that would disappear within 3 generations regardless. The sisters who had waged war in courtrooms and society pages had been fighting over a temporary advantage that time would erase anyway. If they had simply split the money and maintained the relationships, the outcome would have been the same financially, but the children would have inherited family instead of feuds. The grandchildren would have had cousins instead of enemies. And the name might have meant something beyond a cautionary tale about what happens when inheritance becomes more important than love. But they chose war, and the children inherited the consequences. The dynasty that could not forgive. In the end, the most expensive thing they bought was victory, because victory required burning the bridge back to love. The pattern is visible now in archives and auction records and family trees that stop mid-century. The Gilded Age produced dynasties that lasted 3 generations at most. The fortunes were built, fought over, and dispersed within 70 years. And the families that should have dominated American society for centuries instead disappeared into obscurity before their great-grandchildren came of age. The question that haunts every archive is simple. Why? Why did extreme wealth turn intimacy into competition? Why did sisters who grew up in the same nursery end up destroying each other in court? Why did families confuse control with safety until control was all they had left? The answer requires understanding what inheritance meant in that specific moment. The Gilded Age was the first time in American history that fortunes were large enough to last multiple generations and complex enough to require professional management. Previous wealth had been land-based, visible, and easily divided. A farm could be split. Acreage could be allocated. The assets were concrete. But railroad stock and trust funds and industrial investments were abstract. They required lawyers to manage and bankers to value and courts to interpret. And that abstraction created space for disagreement, manipulation, and war. The sisters understood that whoever controlled the legal instruments controlled everything. A daughter who managed her father's will could reward allies and punish enemies. A sister who influenced her mother's trust decisions could shift millions with a conversation. And a woman who married the right lawyer or banker or advisor could weaponize professional expertise against family members who lacked those connections. So they fought for control, not because they needed more money, but because losing control meant becoming vulnerable to those who had it. The tragedy was that control was an illusion. The more energy they spent fighting each other, the less value remained to control. The legal fees consumed capital. The feuds made business partners wary. The scandals reduced social capital that could have been monetized through marriages or partnerships. They were destroying the thing they were fighting to preserve. But they could not stop, because stopping required admitting that the fight had been pointless, that the wasted years and broken relationships and legal bills had achieved nothing, that they had sacrificed love for an advantage that disappeared the moment they claimed it. The Gilded Age taught America to worship inheritance. It created a culture where family wealth was the primary marker of worth, and losing that wealth meant losing identity. In that context, in fighting to preserve inheritance made sense, even when the fight cost more than the prize. The sisters were products of that culture. They had been raised to believe their value came from their family names and the fortunes attached to those names. They had been taught that marriage was a transaction and children were assets and family was a corporation that happened to share blood. And they had internalized those lessons so thoroughly that when inheritance was threatened, they had no tools except warfare. The architecture of trust law encouraged the fighting. Wills and trusts from that era were designed to control beyond the grave. They specified not just who received what, but how it could be used, who could manage it, and under what conditions access could be revoked. These instruments were meant to protect family wealth. Instead, they created permanent mechanisms for family conflict. A trust that gave one daughter control over another's income guaranteed resentment. A will that made siblings compete for approval guaranteed conflict. And inheritance structures that treated daughters differently than sons guaranteed that gender would become another dimension of fighting. The economic context mattered too. The Gilded Age fortunes were built during a period of minimal regulation and maximum exploitation. The same qualities that made these men successful in business, aggression, ruthlessness, zero-sum thinking, were then modeled for their daughters in the domestic sphere. The sisters learned to approach family relationships the way their fathers approached business, as competitions to be won rather than connections to be maintained. And the era's gender constraints meant women's only battlefield was family. Men could fight in business, politics, or law. Women were confined to the domestic and social, so they poured all their competitive energy into the only arena available. They turned family into a war zone because they had no other outlet for ambition. The newspaper culture amplified everything. Private feuds that might have stayed private in earlier eras became public entertainment. And once the fights were public, retreat became impossible. A sister could not back down without looking weak to an audience that was watching and judging. The performance had to continue, even when both sides wanted it to stop. The children paid the price. They inherited money but lost family. They received trust funds but lost the ability to trust. They learned that intimacy was dangerous, and vulnerability was weakness, and love was something that could be revoked if you failed to meet expectations. And they passed that lesson to their own children. The damage cascaded across generations, not because the money still mattered, but because the relational patterns had been established. The families learned to fight and never learned to reconcile. so they kept fighting over smaller and smaller stakes until there was nothing left to fight over. The mansions are museums now, if they survived at all. The Breakers is owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County. Marble House operates as a historic site. The Metropolitan Museum holds collections that were once private family treasures. The objects survived. The families did not. Visitors walk through those rooms and marvel at the excess. They see the gold leaf and the marble and the scale. What they do not see are the will contests and the sister wars and the legal fees that turned those objects into public property. The houses stand as monuments not to success, but to the cost of confusing wealth with worth. The records remain for anyone willing to search. The court filings, the auction catalogs, the society page accounts of parties that hid desperation, the private letters that survived the estate sales, all of it documenting the same pattern. Wealth generated conflict. Conflict generated legal battles. Legal battles consumed wealth. And the cycle repeated until nothing remained but records. The lesson should be simple. Inheritance is not worth destroying family. No amount of money justifies the cost of turning siblings into enemies. The sisters who fought for decades to preserve Dynasty ended up ensuring Dynasty could not survive. But the lesson is only simple in hindsight. In the moment, when you are convinced you are right and your sister is wrong, when you believe control equals safety, when you have been raised to measure worth in dollars and status, the fight feels necessary. It feels like survival, and by the time you realize it was destruction, the damage is irreversible. The Gilded Age sisters bought victory at a price that made victory meaningless. They won the legal battles and lost everything that mattered. They preserved their inheritance and destroyed their legacy. And they proved that the most expensive thing a family can purchase is the certainty that they were right and everyone else was wrong. Because that certainty costs everything. It costs relationships and reputation and the possibility of reconciliation. It costs children who grow up learning to fight instead of love. It costs grandchildren who inherit feuds instead of family. And it costs dynasties that could have lasted centuries, but instead disappeared within 3 generations. The ballrooms are empty now, the guest lists are archived, the invitations have faded, but the lesson remains. When love becomes debt and family becomes ledger, everyone loses. The sisters who waged war in silk and gold learned this too late. And the dynasties they thought they were protecting died not from external threats, but from internal ones. They destroyed themselves, and they called it preservation.